Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today we explain Prophets Kings 1 chapter 2 in a clear and simple way, step by step. Chapter 2 is just an incredibly gripping tale. It literally starts with a dying king's final instructions to his son, sets up what is basically a royal hit list, and follows a young king as he ruthlessly but systematically secures his brand new throne. This whole chapter is all about the consolidation of absolute power. Let's just dive right in.
So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to start with the context, look at David's final charge, and then break down the specific threats Solomon faces: Adonijah's request, exile and justice, and Shimei's broken oath, before wrapping it all up with some key practical lessons.
Part 1. Context: a new king on the throne. To really get what's happening in Chapter 2, we just need a super quick reminder of where we left off at the end of Chapter 1. David is incredibly old, and the transition of power, well, it's just taken place.
So, Solomon has officially been crowned king of Israel. But as you probably know, having the crown on your head and actually having a secure kingdom, well, those are two very different things. His older brother, Adonijah, very recently tried to usurp the throne behind David's back, and he actually had the backing of key military and religious figures. So as we step into Chapter 2, Solomon is the king, for sure, but the kingdom is fragile. Serious threats are looming, both from his own family and from powerful, entrenched figures from his father's past.
Okay, Part 2. David's final charge. We arrive at the very first verses of Prophets Kings 1, chapter 2. The time has finally drawn near for King David to die, and he calls his son Solomon to his deathbed to give him his final, absolutely crucial instructions.
David opens with a phrase that's pretty poetic but also very grounded. He says, "I am about to go the way of all the earth." In plain English, this is just a polite idiom, meaning I'm dying. I'm going the way every human being eventually goes. And because of this harsh reality, he tells Solomon to be strong and to show himself a man. The psychological weight here is just immense. The massive burden of leadership is about to fall squarely on Solomon's shoulders, and David really wants him steeled for the reality of ruling.
Now, before getting into the messy, frankly brutal business of politics, David lays down a firm spiritual foundation in verses 3 and 4. He tells Solomon to observe what the Lord requires, to walk in his ways and to keep his decrees and commands exactly as they're written in the law of Moses. And why is this so absolutely crucial? Well, because David is passing on the specific conditional covenant that God made with him. David clearly explains that if Solomon and his descendants do this, they're going to prosper. And God will fulfill his promise that David's lineage will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. So the spiritual obedience, it's directly tied to the political security of the entire kingdom. But literally immediately after this beautiful spiritual charge, David completely shifts gears to a very pragmatic, highly specific political hit list. And notice how detailed David is about their past deeds. First up is Joab, his military commander. David points out that Joab shed innocent blood by killing two rival commanders, Abner and Amasa, during peacetime. David instructs Solomon, look, deal with them according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. Second, David asks for kindness to the sons of Barzillai. Why? Because they actually supported David when he was fleeing for his life, so David says they should eat at Solomon's table. And finally, there's Shimei. Now, Shimei had called down some bitter curses on David years ago. At the time, David had personally sworn an oath not to kill him, but now he tells Solomon, "You are a man of wisdom. Bring his gray head down to the grave in blood." You see, Solomon isn't personally bound by David's old oath, and David wants this loose end completely tied up before he passes.
Which brings us to Part 3, Adonijah's fatal request. Right after giving these intense instructions, David passes away. He reigned for 40 years and is buried in the city of David. Solomon is now sitting on the throne, but almost immediately he faces his first major test, and it comes straight from his older brother Adonijah.
Let's actually look at how Adonijah maneuvers here, starting in verses 13 through 18. It's wild. He goes to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. When she rightfully asks if he comes peacefully, he insists he does. He then spends this incredibly cunning narrative, basically claiming that the kingdom was naturally his and that all Israel looked to him as king. But, he acknowledges that things changed and the Lord gave it to his brother. With Bathsheba somewhat disarmed by this, he sets his trap. He says, "I have one small request to make of you." He asks Bathsheba to go to King Solomon and ask that Abishag the Shunammite be given to him in marriage. And Bathsheba?
Well, she actually agrees to mediate and takes this request straight to Solomon. So Bathsheba goes to Solomon. The king respectfully bows to his mother, sits on his throne, and even has a seat brought for her at his right hand. She passes on this small request. But instead of just granting it, Solomon is absolutely furious. He swears an oath that Adonijah will be put to death that very day. Which really leads us to a crucial question here. Why in the world did asking for a maiden cost Adonijah his life?
The key to understanding this is knowing who Abishag the Shunammite actually was. Back in chapter 1, she was brought in to be King David's beautiful final attendant, basically to care for him in his old age. Well, in the ancient world, claiming the concubine or the intimate attendant of a former king, that was a very public declaration of claiming his throne. It's a move of incredible arrogance on Adonijah's part. Solomon sees right through the deception instantly. He tells his mother she might as well be asking for the entire kingdom for Adonijah, along with his co-conspirators Abiathar and Joab. It wasn't just a romantic request, it was a treasonous power play. And because of this, Solomon sends Benaiah, his loyal commander, to strike down Adonijah. Just like that, the first threat is completely neutralized.
Moving to Part 4, Exile and Justice. With Adonijah dead, Solomon doesn't miss a beat. He immediately moves to systematically handle the men who had previously conspired with his brother, Abiathar the priest and Joab the commander. Solomon deals with both of them very decisively, but in very different ways. Let's contrast their fates for a second. Solomon summons Abiathar the priest and straight up tells him he deserves to die. However, Solomon actually spares his life. Why? Well, because Abiathar had carried the Ark of the Lord before King David and had actually shared in all of David's hardships over the years. So instead of death, Solomon strips him of the priesthood and exiles him to his fields in Anathoth. Now, by exiling Abiathar to Anathoth, the text notes this actually fulfilled an old prophecy against the house of Eli from back in Samuel's time. Solomon acts politically, but it achieves a spiritual decree. Joab, on the other hand, is a totally different story. Joab had a long history of shedding innocent blood, just like David had warned, so Solomon orders his execution to formally clear himself and his father's house of that blood guilt.
Now when Joab hears what happened to Adonijah and Abiathar, he knows he's next, so he flees to the tent of the Lord, which is the sacred tabernacle, and he literally takes hold of the horns of the altar, seeking holy sanctuary. Solomon sends Benaiah to strike him down. Benaiah orders him to come out, but Joab refuses, saying, "No, I will die here." Benaiah reports this back to the king, and Solomon, he is totally unyielding. He tells Benaiah to do exactly as Joab says, strike him down right there by the altar, to finally repay him for the innocent man he murdered without David's knowledge. So Benaiah executes Joab, and Solomon promotes Benaiah to head of the army and places Zadok as the new chief priest. The board is slowly being cleared.
Part 5. Shimei's Broken Oath. Now we move to the final name on David's hit list, Shimei, the man from Benjamin, who had so bitterly cursed David. And Solomon handles this with just incredible political strategy. Remember, David's hands were tied on this one because he had sworn by the Lord not to kill Shimei with the sword. Solomon, however, devises a very strict test of loyalty. He summons Shimei and lays down a crystal-clear law. Shimei has to build a house in Jerusalem and live there permanently. Basically, he is placed under strict house arrest. Solomon warns him that on the very day he leaves and crosses the Kidron Valley, he will certainly die. The Kidron Valley is super vital here because it was the physical boundary separating Jerusalem from the rest of the land, making it a clear, undeniable tripwire. And Shimei completely agrees to these terms, saying, "What you say is good. I will obey." So for 3 whole years, Shimei actually stays in Jerusalem. It seems fine, but then 2 of his slaves run away to another city. Shimei saddles his donkey and leaves Jerusalem to go retrieve them. When Solomon finds out that Shimei left and returned, he summons him again. Solomon asks him this absolutely piercing question: "Why then did you not keep your oath to the Lord and obey the command I gave you?" Shimei had literally broken the very condition that was keeping him alive. Solomon reminds him of all the wrong he did to David, declares that the Lord is repaying him for his wrongdoing, and calmly orders Benaiah to execute him. And this whole sequence brilliantly illustrates the sheer efficiency of Solomon's early reign. Just look at this timeline. He neutralized the immediate internal threat by executing Adonijah. He purged the priesthood by exiling Abiathar. He purged the military command by executing Joab. And finally, he tied up the absolute last loose end from his father's era by executing Shimei. Step by step, threat by threat, the entire board has been completely cleared.
Part 6. Lessons and Recap. As we wrap up our step-by-step walkthrough of the chapter,
Let's look at a few of the simple, highly practical life lessons we can take away from all these intense events.
First, the text clearly shows us that the consequences of our actions eventually catch up to us. Joab thought he had gotten away with murder during peacetime, and Shimei thought his bitter curses were totally in the past, but their own past deeds directly brought about their downfalls. This really matters in our lives because holding on to past wrongs or trying to bury our misdeeds, it rarely works out long term. Second, true wisdom is absolutely required to navigate complex challenges in our own lives. Notice how Solomon didn't just act wildly, he observed carefully. He saw right through Adonijah's deception, and he set a perfectly legal, boundary-based trap for Shimei. Finally, we see that justice is sometimes delayed but not denied. David carried the heavy weight of Joab's and Shimei's actions for years, but justice was ultimately served under Solomon's reign.
Right before Shimei is executed, Solomon makes a defining statement about the outcome of all these purges. He says, "But King Solomon will be blessed, and David's throne will remain secure before the Lord forever." This was the ultimate theological and frankly political goal of the entire chapter, removing wickedness to officially secure the promise God made to his father.
And this brings us full circle to verse 12, which serves as the overarching theme for this entire explainer. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. Through calculated wisdom, swift justice, and sheer political force, the transition is totally complete. The kingdom is solely and safely in his hands.
Which leaves us with a fascinating question as we close today. With his rivals completely eliminated, the military and priesthood now totally loyal to him, and absolute power entirely secured, how will Solomon use this immense, unchecked authority in the chapters to come? Will he actually follow his father's spiritual charge? Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.